Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Derek Main. So today, with apologies for the terrible aesthetics here of like a hostage video, I'm still like terrible at this part of it, but whatever, right? I am going to talk about, I guess my favorite book maybe of the 21st century. Definitely a book, one of those fulcrum type books that sends you into sort of whole other journeys and places as a reader, a writer, and one of my favorite authors. For anyone who knows me or knows this channel is surely aware, and that is Roberto Bolaño's 2666. This is translated from the Spanish by Natasha Wimmer. And I'm only talking today about part one, the part about the critics. For those who don't know, 2666 is divided into 5 different parts or books. This version by FSG clocks in just under 900 pages. And it was originally Bolaño's intention to release each of those 5 parts as their own separate book. As he was dying, he made this intention known in order to, for profitability, to take better care of his heirs, his wife and children. It was thought, I guess, by him that 5 books make more money than one. And then as the literary heirs were working through this text, they made the executive decision after Bolaño's death for the literary value of the thing to release it as it was intended. It is sort of famously considered, I'm going to change that word real quick. It is famously referred to as an unfinished novel. I don't find this to be the case at all. I think it is entirely finished. I think that it, certainly had he lived more, and we all wish he had, it would have been different. He would have changed aspects of it, continuous editing, that kind of thing. But it is contained. There is nothing that feels unfinished about this work whatsoever. And in fact, you read a lot. So another thing Bolaño is sort of famous for, and this is the estate of Bolaño, not the man himself, but finding text. So every 18 months or so, a new sort of scrap is found and turned into a novella. And many of these things have similar characters, either to 2666 or his other commercial success, and commercial success, of course, being extremely relative, because we are talking about literary fiction, but Savage Detectives. And in many ways, I think you can read those texts as sort of like tryouts to have made it into these larger works and whole universes. Although, as you know, if you've read Bolaño, most of his work occurs in a similar sort of universe. Well, before I get into 2666, and specifically part one, the part about the critics, there's 2 really important things I need to say up front about me talking about this book. 1, I am not an academic in any way. I am a fan, not just when it comes to this, but when it comes to literature. I don't know what I'm talking about. I have scraggly notes about things I want to point out, things I want to say. This read-through I'm doing now is my 3rd full read-through of 2666. I've watched a handful of videos, mostly by my friends, such as Dan from the Weird Book Club, discuss 2666. Most recently, I think Leaf by Leaf did one. I love listening to those. I've read a few articles that are more academic in nature, but I've never read any sort of companion text or anything. I don't know what I'm talking about. This is a fan's notes, as all of my things are. And the second thing that's really important to know is that I am going to discuss this book for one of the few times on my channel, fully expecting you to have already read it. So, if you have not already read it and you love reading, I would turn this off, because there's a minimal amount of joy. Hopefully I'm able to do something that provides a minimal amount of joy in discussing this book for, let's say, 25 to 30 minutes, or discussing this part of the book. It is nothing like the experience of reading the book. And because this is literary fiction, spoilers, the concept of spoilers, is sort of laughable. And there's not much you could spoil about this, despite the fact that Bolaño, in this work, and the aptly named Savage Detectives, and much of his work, is actually informed by noir and detective writing and detective motifs. So there typically is a mystery, a mysterious element. But if you come to Bolaño at all, I think you realize that the story and the work that he does is not rooted in the revelation of the mystery, but rather in the searching and in the searchers themselves, specifically psychologically, what it does to those people who are forever looking, forever curious, what it does to those detectives. And we'll get into what that means briefly. But so there's nothing necessarily to spoil, but I am looking at this in a really specific frame. And that is, what is he doing in this book and how is he doing it? I'm coming at it really as a writer that wants to crack some sort of code and figure out what is so alluring and what sort of tricks is he pulling. And because of that, I do think, if you've not read the book, that it's not necessarily a matter of it will be spoiling anything, but I just think that it will be a less enjoyable experience. So those are the two things. I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm doing this as if you've read the book. So why have I chosen to do it in parts? Well, I was never planning on doing a video about 2666. It is far too close to me in terms of me, the writer, in terms of me, the absolute slut for literature. It's almost so important to me that it becomes difficult to talk about in any kind of engaging way in this format. Now, if you and I were meeting at a bar or a coffee shop, whatever, and you had read it, yes, we'd be talking for hours, and we'd have an awesome time, right? But I would need that back and forth, that conversational element, to really sort of draw out what I'm thinking on that moment, because this is massive. This is a huge book. As I said, it was meant to be divided, or is divided into 5 parts. It was meant to be 5 different books. Well, part of what I want to do, is figure out what he's doing, right? So when I hit a recent reading slump, which I talked about with Michael from Knowledge Loss and Dan from Weird Book Club, we did a live thing, a live vlog, or whatever the word is that you're supposed to use these days, where we discussed reading slumps. And when I was in it, I typically, as I normally do, I kind of go back to something as a reread. And this, I went back right to the source, the heart, one of my favorites. Definitely my favorite book I've read in the last, say, 10 years. So I was coming at it really in a narrative sense of trying to figure out what it is he's pulling off. And to do that, I thought it would be best to sort of isolate these parts and then see, well, how did he construct it from these isolated parts? And more importantly, how are these parts meant to communicate with each other? What is that connective tissue? And does that connective tissue have anything grander to say in terms thematically, or is that connective tissue merely structural and is just a way to sort of make this story epic? Okay, well, I don't know if there's going to be a follow-up video from this for part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. As I said, when I started reading it, I did not anticipate that I would be making a video. And I don't look up here and see the timer. I see 10 minutes in, I haven't even started talking about it, which is a problem. But I started to flag things and realized I did have something, I think, to say about part 1, the part about the critics. I may or may not have some more things to say about the other parts. For anyone who has read the work, and hopefully if you're listening right now, again, you have, and the rest of you have cut off. Part 4, the part about the crimes, is most likely the part that you are most both familiar with and also the most infamous. What could I possibly say about the part about the crimes? I'm not sure. I'm not there yet, though, in this reread. So let's focus on the part about the critics. The part about the critics is I can sum up plot-wise what it's about very quickly. 4 critics meet. And the 4 critics are 3 gentlemen. Peltier and Espinosa are the 2 younger of the group. And then Piero Marino, is the older gentleman of the group. He's also crippled. He is in a wheelchair. The 4th critic is the one woman, Liz Norton. So we've got Marino, Peltier, Espinosa, and Norton. And the quilting point, the reason for their friendship is that they each are scholars of a particular obscure and extremely private, as in part of their search is going to be trying to find him, right? Trying to locate him. But German author Benno von Archimboldi. Now, Archimboldi, their obsession over Archimboldi and over understanding his life and who he is in order to have another frame to enjoy and study his work is only really important in so much as it provides Bolaño with a device where he can then get into the heads of 4 literary types, 4 literary critics. And this is something that everyone has their kind of like favorites when it comes to style and writers. And for me, I love a writer probably because it's like me, that is literature sick and obsessed. Enrique Villamates is one of my favorite authors, and he describes literature sickness in exquisite detail in many, many of his books. Well, Bolaño does as well. I mean, The Savage Detectives is full of poets, and this is 4 sort of literary detectives in and of themselves, in their own right, where they want to absorb as much as they can of this mysterious German author. And because we then get sort of deep psychological insights into these people, I think Bolaño is able to endow them with a real literary richness and fullness because of their occupation and because of their interests and their obsessions. And I think presumably their interests are somewhat linked to Bolaño's. He's able to use them as stand-ins in some ways for some of his own passions because they share this one, singular sort of passion with him. A couple of those themes that are going to run throughout. One huge one is nationality. Nationality is big in all Bolaño's works. I'm not smart enough, again, from the beginning to know really why. Although I will say that being Chilean by birth and then spending most of his life in Europe, in Spain, and then some in Mexico City, he's got North America, South America, Europe. And a very worldly author in that sense. And he also makes real sweeping, big generalizations about people and nationalities. And I think possibly that could partly be because he sees everyone through this really interesting lens of kind of always being an expatriate. Literature, of course, is another one of the primary themes, and you can see why that would be one shared. Painting is another one. Painting and the arts, again, understanding creatives, understanding artists, getting at some sort of mystery of life. All of this is very important, I think, to Bolaño, and certainly to the characters that he writes. All right, the first thing that we notice he's doing is a lot of nesting. So, at one point, I set out to count how many stories are nested. And here's what I mean by that. Standalone little stories, vignettes, larger than an anecdote, more than an aside, could be a short story, in some cases long enough to maybe even be a small novella, that are told by the characters or remembered by the characters, and it becomes this extremely sort of long and detailed tangent. These are the narrative stories, or narrative device where they're nested. So these stories are nested. And that's why earlier when I talked about all these new novellas that are found, it seems like they're sort of trying out for one of Bolaño's big books. I think that's where that feeling comes from. But it is interesting how little actually occurs on the ground amongst the lives of these four critics. They go to conferences to talk about Arcimboldi. They sit in cafes, they sit in apartments to talk about Arcimboldi and to gossip about other Archimboldians. A love affair begins between Peltier and Norton, and then Espinosa and Norton, and then Peltier, Espinosa, and Norton, and then finally Marino and Norton, but only for like the very end and just a whiff of it. We actually don't get to see much of it on the page. Much of the work is centered around the love triangle of Espinosa, Peltier, and Norton, and the feelings primarily in the men. We do not get into Liz Norton's mindset the same way we do with the men. And it is self-deprecating to men. You know, these are two men that are in a sort of intellectual, artistic, and then now physical, sexual competition. And that plays on aspects of their insecurity and manliness that are, of course, extremely interesting to sort of delve into. But we don't get much of Norton's angle from that. Not much of her camera view, because it's not really her story. And in some ways, it's not really Peltier or Espinosa's either. We do get a voyeuristic feeling as we're going through the text, the part about the critics, because we really are kind of eavesdropping in on ordinary life amongst these four people and the ways in which they're enmeshed and entangled. But who's narrating the story? Not clear. Where it fits into the broader picture, not clear at first. It is mysterious. And that's the quality that exists throughout all of his work, but obviously is a huge factor in 2666, a title of which we don't even know where it comes from. So I'm going to talk briefly about one of the nested stories, and it's one that comes up a few different times. I think it's the most important story in the part one, and it's about Edwin Johns, the painter. So on page 97, I think, is when Edwin Johns makes his first appearance. No, 97 is when we get the reveal. So Edwin Johns is a painter that first Liz Norton tells Marini about. And then Marini, chances he becomes a little obsessed, ends up getting to go meet this painter and learn why he did something. What did he do? Well, he cut off his hand, and then he put that hand up on the painting, and that was his art. And that was his big break as well, because he became a very famous artist. And Marini became obsessed with the question of why did he do it? And so he goes and he asks Edwin Johns this question. Edwin Johns sort of tries to talk him out of learning the answer, insinuating that somehow learning the answer will hurt him. Extremely important right here. That is the essence of Bolaño's storytelling, and I think philosophy in general. He sets up these exquisite mysteries, these mysteries that have something to do with meaning, something to do with death, something to do with the central question of why and how we exist and how to exist. Something that the poets know, something that artists have a spark of, something that priests may claim to know. Where is that thing? What is that thing? And Johns, much like Bolaño here, I think, throughout his whole work, says to Marino, essentially, I can tell you, I can answer this for you, but it will come with grave consequences. I think those grave consequences are because seeking is pleasurable. It gives us a purpose. There are little steps along the way that you sort of notch off, clues. They brighten us, they enliven us. Knowing, less so. Finally, finding that answer is typically a disappointment. In this case, Edwin Johns cut off his hand and put it on the wall for money. He understood that it would turn him into a famous artist and give him lots of money. So disappointing to Marino, anticlimactic for all. But he warned you. That's important because you're about to read a 900-page book that is centered around gruesome crimes in Juarez, Mexico. Here it's St. Teresa. It's a fictional named city, but that is the crimes. The clothing factory workers, the women who are being almost systematically, brutally murdered over a wide span of years. And as I said earlier, the part about the crimes, as anyone who is known, we are going to dive fully into that. And yet he tells you in this beginning with sort of a much less consequential story, because this is just one man's choice to cut off his hand, that if you go searching, ultimately knowing the answer is going to be deeply, deeply unsatisfying. What about connections to other parts of the book? Well, the first time that we get a mention of the murders is page 43. Around this time, Marino was the first of the four to read an article about the killings in Sonora, which appeared in Il Manifesto and was written by an Italian reporter who had gone to Mexico to cover the Zapatista guerrillas. The news was horrible, he thought. In Italy, there were serial killers too, but they hardly ever killed more than 10 people, whereas in Sonora, the dead numbered well over 100. There we are in 43. Then in 99, we've got a connection to Mexico City. Because one of the questions is one of geography and nationality, of course, right? These murders are taking place in Mexico. So we're starting off with, Norton's in England. Marino is in Spain. I think Espinosa and Peltier are in Paris. They're studying a German author. It's a European book. So where's the connection? 99. One of these Mexico City friends said Alator, and he said it innocently, with that slight hint of clumsy boasting typical of minor writers, had met Archambault just the other day. So they meet these group of intellectuals or minor writers, I guess, there at one of these conferences, and they sort of casually mention, we met Archambault. So there you see there's that quilting point again. This German reclusive writer, Benno von Archambault. And now we've connected him from Europe to Mexico. That's where the search needs to move to. So page 104. Give this a little just brief whiff of a clue. Santa Teresa, said the old man. Do you know it? No, said El Cerdo. I've been to Hermosillo a few times, given talks on literature a while ago, but never to Santa Teresa. I think it's a big city, said the old man. It's big, yes, said El Cerdo. There are factories there, and problems too. I don't think it's a nice place. Okay, anyone who talks to you about Bolaño is probably going to talk about the sense of doom, foreboding, and horror. And there's something really horrifying about reading that a second time after you know everything to come. I think there are problems there. I don't think it is a nice place. Page 112 is an extremely important point in the book because we are going to be introduced to the primary character of, the titular character. I'm going to call it the titular character. I'm not sure if I'm going to call it the primary yet. The titular character of part 2, the part about Amalfitano. And we meet Amalfitano, I think on page 12, yes. In his note, after wishing them a pleasant and enjoyable stay in his city, Augusto Guerrero talked about a certain Professor Amalfitano, an expert on Benno von Archambault, who would diligently present himself at the hotel that very afternoon to help them as best he could. In a poetic turn of phrase, the flowery closing compared the desert to a petrified garden. So we meet him there. Espinosa hears about the murders on page 137. Then Espinosa remembered that night before. Next night before, they're drinking heavily in a bar with these literary friends in Mexico City. One of the boys had told them the story of the women who were being killed. All he remembered was that the boy had said there were more than 200 of them, and he'd had to repeat it 2 or 3 times because neither Espinosa nor Peltier could believe his ears. Not believing your ears, though, thought Espinosa, is a form of exaggeration. You see something beautiful and you can't believe your eyes. Someone tells you something about the natural beauty of Iceland, people bathing in thermal springs among geysers. In fact, you've seen it in pictures, but still you can't believe it. Although obviously you believe it. Exaggeration is a form of polite admiration. You set it up so the person you're talking to can say it's true. And then you say incredible. First you can't believe it, and then you think it's incredible. And sorry, I'm going a little more on this because I do want you to get a feel and sense of, even though I hope you've read it, I love reading aloud and I love reading that. I see we're at the 30-minute mark. I'm going to try not to make this more than 40. I have a couple more points I want to make. And yeah, That's what we'll do. So those are a look at the connections between these next parts and the next story. The last story I want to talk about is that love triangle, Espinosa, Peltier, Norton. And I just want to briefly touch on one part where it becomes really dark and explosive, as most of Bolaño's work does, on page 74. And what happens is there is a cab driver. They are in the cab with Liz Norton, that they're both sleeping with. And the cab driver and then they get into a minor disagreement and they beat him viciously. They beat him so badly, it's on the news. They are perhaps worried about the authorities catching them. They are not caught, but they beat him basically almost to death. And it is done in almost with an eroticism. I mean, there is just a fever attached to them, and they really seem to be having this threesome, this menage a trois that they've hinted at and talked about around the edges of in that moment of violence. And it connects sex to violence for men in a way that I think is extremely important for the context of what we know is happening, where we're going. When they stopped kicking him, they were sunk for a few seconds in the strangest calm of their lives. It was as if they had finally had the menage a trois they'd so often dreamed of. Peltier felt as if he had come. Espinosa felt the same to a slightly different degree. Norton, who was staring at them without seeing them in the dark, seemed to have experienced multiple orgasms. So it's interesting there, the connecting sex to an abhorrent violence. All right, I'm going to go on 4 asides here. And for each one, I have one word written down. So we'll see what the heck I meant a few weeks ago when I first set this out. 105, writer. Okay. A writer on the left whom even the situationists respected. A person who didn't pretend to reconcile the irreconcilable, as was the fashion these days. Imagine, said Peltier, Archman Boldy wins the Nobel, and at that very moment we appear, leading him by the hand. Okay, so why I pulled that out? Very simple. A person who didn't pretend to reconcile the irreconcilable, as was the fashion these days. So much of literature and writing went through a brief, hopefully over period of over-moralizing, where we did ask our authors to reconcile the irreconcilable, particularly on the left, as mentioned there. 106, reader, and that also, by the way, Bolaño was a leftist. If you follow me at all, you know that I am too. I think that's been extremely dangerous because what we did is we ceded the freedom of speech ground to a ascending and dangerous fascist right in literature. I think that's over, hopefully. We do not want creatives and artists or transgressives to feel like the only place where their voice is safe is on the right, okay? Everyone has awful thoughts. Everyone has these kinds of fears, this insecurity, this darkness rising up within them. If we cede that the only people that are free and safe to express this artistically are on the right, we lose. All right, 106, I have written down reader. Marini, who admired Schwab, or more precisely, felt a great fondness for him, thought at first that his trip to Sonora could be a kind of lesser homage to the French writer and also to the English writer who the French writer had gone to visit. But when he got back to Turin, he saw that travel was beyond him. So he called his friends and lied, saying the doctor had strictly forbidden anything of the kind. Peltier and Espinosa accepted his explanation and promised they would call regularly to keep him posted on the search they were undertaking, the definitive search this time. So, I see. So this is the grave part. Okay. So he wants to visit Robert Louis Stevenson's grave here. A character who's just been introduced. When he got to Samoa after many hardships, he didn't visit Stevenson's grave, partly because he was too sick, and partly because what's the point of visiting the grave of someone who hasn't died? Stevenson and Schwab owed this simple revelation to his trip lived inside him. Now I remember. Okay, so Bolaño is dead. Roberto Bolaño, the person who wrote this. But he is not alive because he lives. He lives inside of me. Page 135, this I wrote, line I like. Okay, well, hopefully there's a little more, direction once I get there. After that moment, reality for Peltier and Espinosa seemed to tear like paper scenery. And when it was stripped away, it revealed what was behind it. A smoking landscape, as if someone, an angel maybe, was tending hundreds of barbecue pits for a crowd of invisible beings. Well, I still like that line. So, past Derek, good looking out. The last one is page 170, and I again have written down writer. Okay. But 170 is in the part about that this must be, I have messed up a 7 somehow because the part ends, this ends around 160. So I can't read my own chicken scratch. If you can, pause it and see if you can find it. I think I got, though, to basically, page 84. So he does this thing with Espinosa and Peltier. A significant chunk, I want to say 50% of it, of this section is probably dedicated to that competitive literary friendship and sex that they're having with Norton, and then wanting her to choose, but then kind of not wanting her to choose. So they end up going, when they're in Mexico, they end up taken to sleeping with whores. And in some ways it's, it's pretty explicit. I mean, and in its detail and in its retelling and in their reasons, like you get a really heavy psychological portrait of these two men and the way they treat these women, which again is really heavy when you consider where we're going to go by the time we get to the part about the crimes. It's almost as if, and this is like really stretchy, but it's almost as if the seedlings are there. What grows eventually is abhorrent. Well, I wrote this one down because I frankly just liked this line. There was a very, very long scene. Peltier is describing Vanessa, one of the prostitutes he slept with, and her whole life. And at the end of this long retelling by Peltier, whores are there to be fucked, Espinosa said, the night Peltier taught him about Vanessa, not psychoanalyzed. And there are differences there in what they need and what they desire out of the women they're paying to sleep with them really come to the surface there. And what their sexual desires are. Because they're different, right? All right. I think that's about all I can say for now. I may do part 2. I may do part 3. I don't know what I'll do. I hope this has been somewhat enjoyable. It's definitely been the hardest one I've ever done. Thanks. Be good to folks.